Welcome, everyone. I'm Ashish Kaushal, the founder of Consciously Unbiased, a movement to build inclusion in the workplace, and also CEO of a staffing firm called Hire Talent. We have an amazing guest today here, Carla Fernandez. She's a co-founder of The Dinner Party, a national network of peer-supported circles for young adult grievers, and the author of a new book called Renegade Grief. In her book, Carla offers tools for people at any stage of grieving in the grieving process. In her work, Carla focuses on building cultures of care within communities and companies. Welcome, Carla. We're happy to have you on the show.
Thanks, Ashish. Excited to be here and excited to chat.
Me too. Let's talk about your new book, Renegade Grief. In the book, you talk about the sense of isolation you had when dealing with the loss of your father in your 20s. Because many people don't know how to address your loss. Why do you think we have such a hard time talking about death and grieving in general?
I like this question because it's like, let's look at the root of the problem first. There's a lot of different threads that I could pull to kind of explain why I think we've lost the plot when it comes to how we tend to grieve. Grief kind of traditionally, historically, across time and space and place has always been something that's been held collectively, something that's been honored in community. And over the course of the 20th century, there were a few kind of moments in which our grief was actually hidden away, quarantined inside the immediate family home. We learned to break bonds with the dead instead of continue bonds with the dead. And there's a whole geek out anthropological explanation of that in the first few chapters of my book. And I think it's kind of been compounded by this crisis of social isolation that we're all aware of and living through, and the places and relationships that we used to go to care for our grief and community with, we no longer have access to in many instances. So in many ways, the work in grief and grief itself is not the problem. It's the social isolation and the awkwardness and the illiteracy around grief that is the problem that I'm interested in and actively working to solve.
Interesting. Why do you think it's awkward?
I think we do live in a death and grief denying culture. I think many people aren't raised in a household that has a healthy relationship to grief, so we never learn how to tend to it in our own lives. We're in a culture that is obsessed with staying young and never aging and certainly never dying. We don't live intergenerationally in the way that humans once did, meaning that we kind of take our elders and put them away places and don't often learn how to walk alongside someone as they're preparing for their own end of life. And it's a muscle, I think, that has atrophied. But the reality is that learning how to grieve and learning how to tend to grief in your life and being in relationship with people with whom you can talk to about your grief is this critical life skill. It's not just this sort of fringe mental health issue, but it's, I think, one of the most important muscles that we can all be strengthening within our personal lives and within our cultures and teams as we move into an era of ever increasing uncertainty and change and loss.
Do you think part of it's also like we're really good at disassociating, so we kind of just pretend not to deal with the grief that we have?
For sure.
Yeah.
Have you seen that in your world or in the circles?
Yeah. And I always tell friends, like, when they lose somebody, that they should take some time off from work and really go through the process, because I think if you don't do it, it comes out in other ways and it affects your health long term.
I agree with that.
But I do think, like, the internet and even just COVID, the fact that we're all sort of isolated as it is, we've gotten into this rhythm of not interacting with people anyway.
Yeah.
And so we disassociate with empathy and grief and loss and stuff like that.
Yep.
How are you trying to change the status quo around the idea of death being taboo to being that something's normal to talk about?
So there's sort of two main bodies of work that I've focused on. The first is The Dinner Party, which is a 501c3 nonprofit. It is a nationwide community of about 20,000 people who are in the age 21 to 45 range of life, who have experienced a significant loss, which means they have had a parent, a sibling, a friend, a partner, a child who has died, and they are looking for peer support circles, basically friends with whom they can find companionship as they tend to and live after a loss like that. It is a complement to seeing a therapist or other types of more traditional grief support, but the kind of core throbbing heart of that work is that it is so important and valuable to have people with whom you can be real and authentic about what you're going through, the highs and the lows and everything in between. And the dinner party work, we started this as sort of a social experiment art project in 2010. And over the course of the last 15 years, led by my co-founder, Lennon Flowers, it has grown to this nationwide network of people that are defying the status quo, which would be, get back to work after 3 days of bereavement leave, maybe talk about that person a couple times a year on holidays where it's relevant, but for the most part, sort of get away from their grief and their story of their loss. And instead we're building community where that can lead, and through that tenderness and authenticity, real deep connections can form. So there's like the community organizing work, and then through sitting around these tables, their dinner parties, people bring dishes related to the person that they lost. We lead with the story of what it was like when they were alive, not just the fact that they're no longer here. I kept hearing these incredible anecdotes from people who maybe didn't feel like they knew how to ritualize or tend to their grief, but were going through a radical, creative process to figure out how would they honor their grief? How would they metabolize it through their own system? So the book, Renegade Grief, the obligatory cover reveal, is really a collection of care practices and rituals that are both time-tested and thousands of years old, and new creative experiments that people in the last 5 years have found helpful. And it offers a bunch of breadcrumbs for people to follow who are looking to tend to their own grief in ways that might defy the status quo, and also for people who are looking to show up for others in their life who are grieving and they want to be the best grief ally that they can be.
Interesting. I love the way you called it the dinner party, because the commonality is still bond, is a way to bond with each other. My wife lost her father when she was in her 20s too, and she used to call it the Dead Dads Club. That her and her friends would bond, she'd build connections with people based on the fact that they both lost their parents. I think yours is much more positive.
We definitely there's a Google Doc at some point where we're like, what should we name this thing? How about the Dead Dads Club? But I think that domain was probably taken, and it felt powerful in the beginning that the invitation was to break bread and feast the dead, which is this sort of ancient human tradition. It is not rocket science what we're doing. It's literally potluck dinners or potluck Zooms. And but there's like a deep human aching for that kind of space and community. And we've only ever had more demand for seats at the table than we've had supply. So it's been interesting to kind of watch this idea take off. And 15 years later, we're still building and growing and creating those spaces for people who are looking for it. Yeah.
The grief expert and author David Kessler said that grief has to be witnessed. Why do you think other people need to witness our grief? And can you talk about how the dinner party started and how being part of the community helps us heal?
Yeah. Love David Kessler. For folks who are listening, if you're interested in the world of grief, he's someone to check out. He's kind of an OG. He was one of the people that researched alongside Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was the early thanatologist, death researcher, whose work has really formed how we relate to grief. Why does it need to be witnessed? I think it's interesting because a lot of people feel like they want to fix people's grief or stop people's grief or save them from it or minimize it or sort of take it away. There's something powerful about recognizing the thing that your grief is wanting is just to be seen and acknowledged. I remember in the months after my dad died feeling like, and this feels kind of like a cheapened metaphor, but this was the association that I had. I felt like I had just seen the most crazy movie of all time. And all I wanted to do was talk to people about it. But all of the people around me had never seen the movie before. You know that feeling when you're have read a great book or have had some mind-bending experience and you're I don't want to talk about the weather. I want to talk about this thing that just blew my mind open. And so for me, creating the dinner party was creating a space within which people could come together and we could talk about that thing and all of our own perspectives on it and witness each other's reactions and interpretations and suffering and epiphanies within this relationship to loss. And what's cool about the work that I get to do is that it's not about fixing, solving, saving, stopping the grief at all. It's about creating containers where people can come in and be wow, this is real. I'm being pushed in these ways. I'm feeling stuck in these ways. I'm feeling expanded in these ways. We're not giving advice. We're not writing our X's to one another. We're just normalizing the experience. And in some ways, I feel like our Western mind doesn't compute that as like deeply powerful because there's not like a solution being discussed, but that actually is the solution, is the normalization, is the witnessing.
Interesting. So I guess that leads me to a question. So it's about hearing and listening, right? So I've always sort of felt weird about asking, like, if somebody loses a parent or loses somebody they love, or even a cat. Like, it's funny. San Francisco has a bereavement policy for animals when you lose an animal, which I think is amazing. But
I love San Francisco.
But you don't know if I should ask somebody how they're doing, or if, and it sounds like we should be asking people how they're feeling or how they're doing post loss, and let them just kind of talk about it. And you don't have to say anything, to just understand, just hear it. Right?
Yeah, I think I hear this all of the time, which is, I know my friend is grieving. I don't want to bring it up because I don't want to bum them out, or I don't want to remind them that this person died, or I don't want to make it uncomfortable. Right? And from the griever's perspective, you're like, my guy, like, I obviously haven't forgotten.
Yeah.
There's a story that I share in the book that is so simple. One of my interviewees, who's a host of a dinner party table, talked about driving to the movies with a friend, and the friend asked, "So your dad died. How's that all going for you?" And it wasn't like, oh, like wincing, pity voice. It was like open and honest, and it allowed for this person to kind of like, share the reality of the situation for them.
Yeah.
It wasn't a long conversation, but it allowed this host of ours to know that this friend was like a safe space with whom they could go to like talk about their loss. And, I think the kind of caveat and nuance of it, because I know a lot of the folks that listen to your work are related to workplace culture. Would I recommend Monday morning at 9 a.m. asking your colleague at the coffee pot, like, how their grief is? Probably not. I might find ways that are maybe more subtle or nuanced to check in with them in a moment where they're not being expected to like run the meeting 5 minutes later or something like that. So yeah, I think it always makes sense to, and is compassionate to, reach out and check in. And I think there's some sort of EQ that we can apply to like when to do it and what kind of response we might expect.
Yeah. And speaking of that, you kind of led us into this, but how can grief impact people in the workplace?
This is one of my favorite topics. As the dinner party was growing, I was the general manager of this awesome company, a creative agency called Enso. Shout out Enso. And a lot of the work that I did there was around talent and culture and hiring and leadership development, etc. And I started to kind of like look at these two parts of my brain, this part of my brain that was creating companionship and spaces for people to tend to grief outside of work. And then inside of this company culture was starting to notice the ways in which people on my team were experiencing grief, and realized that we didn't have any other than like, 10 words of the bereavement policy in the company handbook. There had never been a discussion internally around like, what is our company policy about how we tend to grieve? We talked a lot about preparing for parental leave and like the stroller that we would buy the new family and the kind of way that we would celebrate people who are at the beginning of life. But we had spent no time talking about how we would create a culture of support or have an equitable policy that everyone had equal access to for folks experiencing the other end of the spectrum. And it kind of sent me down this rabbit hole of like, okay, who's doing this right? And I remember asking all of these other colleagues of mine who worked in the kind of culture, leadership, HR space. And most of them were like, ooh, we've never talked about it. Like, we too have the sentence-long bereavement policy, but like, and that was many years ago now. And it's been really cool to watch this conversation evolve. And there's now like different service providers, and there's more thoughtfulness around this. And the dinner party offers trainings for workplaces, all different sectors and sizes, to help create what we call a culture of grief readiness inside of organizations. But the truth is that it's not that it's not impacting your culture. Like, every single organization is being impacted by grief. The question is whether or not you are opening your eyes to it and creating the kind of policies and protocols and culture such that the grief doesn't sideline the work, doesn't sideline the culture, but is brought to the surface, tended to, and, there's like a sense of psychological safety and clarity around it.
And what's the cost of not addressing this?
So much absenteeism and presenteeism, of people who are maybe back at work after a loss, but the aren't able to get their job done because actually they need to change slightly what their workload is in this period of acute grief. People who are needing to take time off related to their grief. Yeah. And I think there's we all know the deep power of psychological safety in the workplace. And we can talk about that generally and vaguely. But if we can't talk about an explicitly concrete moment where psychological safety is needed in a moment of when someone has experienced a loss, I feel like it all just becomes buzzwords and jargon. Supporting grieving employees is where the rubber hits the road there. And to me, it's interesting to think about it, not just in terms of I think about these 3 levels. There's what does an organization do when someone on the staff dies, which happens. Often that's when we hear from organizations because they're in the crisis mode. Yeah. We have tools for that. And yet my advice and counsel is make sure you have thought through what you might do as a response before you get that phone call and you yourself are grieving. There's the type of grief readiness in the workplace that's around how do you support an employee or a team member who's experienced a loss outside of work. And then there's this other a little bit more esoteric but equally important idea of grief readiness, which is our organizational culture comfortable talking about grief in other forms, like the grief of layoffs, the grief related to a project totally flopping, the grief related to, all of the mini losses that we might experience within an organization's ecosystem. I think there's a lot to be gained by introducing that elephant and introducing practices to witness that grief such that it's not kind of sequestered and festering under the rug.
Let me ask you, so when you lost your father, you were working at the time, right? At the creative agency?
I wasn't there yet, but I was working somewhere else.
Okay. Well, the place you're working, when you went into work, people were aware of it. Were they just kind of silent and staring, or did they talk about it? And how did the silence and staring feel?
Silent and staring. And I had a manager at the time that I had told what was going on. She knew I was caring for someone with terminal cancer. And she was, I was lucky to be in a position where my manager was someone who I felt enough resonance with, whom I could say hey, this is what's happening at home. It's not going to affect the hours I'm showing up for work or my output for now. If I think that might change, I'll let you know. So, and it's interesting because when we look at organizational culture and what an individual employee's experience is, you can have 2 people in the same level of seniority, same department, same organization, but their experiences related to how the company holds grief can be entirely different based on who their manager is and whether that person has the empathy to tend to what's going on for them, is familiar enough with the company policies such that they can figure out how to move work around or report to them how many days off they can take. Anyway, so I was really lucky in that situation to have had an amazing manager who I felt that kind of level of openness with. Yeah. I didn't expect her to be my therapist. She didn't try to be my therapist, and yet we could have an open line of communication about what was happening in the caretaker role I was playing. And I also remember this sort of general, walking to my desk in the weeks where my dad was really in the end, and in the weeks after, kind of wondering, who knew? Does this guy that just gave me a thumbs up as I came into the office, is he familiar with what's going on? Is he just being kind and doesn't know? And I think a lot of the work that we end up doing with organizations is getting clear with the person who's experiencing the loss, what the communications plan is to the rest of the team, such that they're not left wondering wow, this person just sent me a passive aggressive email, but did they know that I just got back from a funeral? So in each organizational plan and strategy is unique to them and what's right for them, but it can be really helpful for a manager to have some kind of a plan in place or a protocol to follow when somebody is experiencing a significant loss.
So the silence and staring makes it worse because it makes you, as a griever, think even more things that you probably shouldn't focus on, right?
And that's what we're here to solve for. Like, you can't stop someone's grief. You don't want to. It's like this very critical human technology that we go through to process impermanence. The thing that we can stop is the cringy friction that happens on top of it and around it that gets in the way of actually tending to the grief.
Okay, got it. How can organizations better support employees who are struggling with grief, whether it's exposure on the job or from personal losses?
I think about it in sort of 3 tiers. I think about the leadership level tier, which is every organization should have some sort of grief strategy, grief readiness strategy. In the same way that we think about how do we support new parents, we need to be thinking about how do we support people who are caretakers or are bereaved. And that thinking should happen not like in the acute fire drill moment when like you get the call, but should be ahead of that, such that when someone reports that there's been a loss experience, like there's a framework that has been thoughtfully considered that people are moving through. There's like the leadership policy level. There's the manager training level. I've heard so many stories of managers who are having their very first conversation about grief in their life when someone on their team comes to them and tells them that somebody has died. There's like no reason that should be the case. Every single person who's responsible for 1 or 100 reports should have had some training and basic literacy and how do you be in conversation with someone who has recently lost someone. The training is not how to be the therapist, how to be the counselor. The training is how do you have a grief sensitive conversation with them such that you can get clear on what work are they still responsible for, what needs to get taken off their plate and for how long, and how do you communicate to the rest of the team such that that person doesn't come back in a week with like, you know, a 6-foot high pile of papers on their desk that they then have to kind of slowly weed through. So if it's organizational, it's manager. And then the third level is just overall community culture. How do you create a culture where it's okay to say the G word, where that's not seen as overly sensitive or overly soft, but actually as like an essential, critical, powerful emotion that all of us will experience at one time or another. I was working recently with an executive coach, and she was realizing through reading the book that she has never in her work talked about grief. She'll talk to, most of her clients are VC-backed tech CEOs, and she's found every other way to talk about grief without saying the G word. Like, what did it bring up for you when that project failed? Or what did you learn from the fact that you had to lay off this many number of people? And it was an interesting moment to watch her recognize that she's left this arrow in her quiver for all of this time because she's been so hesitant to talk about it because it kind of has this taboo around it. So I'm so interested in like, how do we just start introducing this? It's not just a concept. It's like a visceral lived reality for so many of us. How do we make it okay to talk about this? And it's not about getting stuck in the grief or lingering there or like any of that, but it's just about naming the elephant and allowing the grief to be witnessed so that we can then move into the next phase.
Do you think companies should have, like in their employee benefits program, a counselor that they can go to if they need to?
I think that all companies should. We have some partners that have gifted employees seats at the dinner party table, which is an offer that we have for organizations. If you want to have a sponsor a membership for someone to come and attend a peer support circle through the dinner party. Some organizations that we've worked with have set up employee resource groups for grieving employees. This generally works in like a larger format organization where it's not like, you know, in a 15-person team, 5 of the 15 are in a grief group together, but when there's more sort of affinity space possibilities. And absolutely, like I think that if the thing we're looking for here is giving tools and resources for our teams to be effective, to perform, to remove the barriers to someone's ability to be thoughtful and strategic and get work done. If someone's experiencing grief and they don't have anywhere to go with it, that's just going to swirl them. And I think there's so many affordable resources that organizations can provide that give employees that space of being witnessed, of helping them troubleshoot and problem solve and move forward.
Definitely. What do you think is most important that comes to mind when you're changing a culture and creating a culture of care within an organization?
The most important thing.
Is there the most important thing, or is it one of many?
I think it's like the thing that's coming to mind, and I'll lead with first thought, best thought, is like sometimes if we can't get it perfectly, we don't do it at all. And I feel like some of these conversations require us to kind of figure things out, and it might be a little bit messy and we might not know the answers right away, but I like to think of like the incremental slow progress towards the ideal being like the most important thing. And, it's important for us within the grief readiness and the workplace conversation to like realize, speaking of conscious biases, making conscious our biases. It's been interesting to watch over the course of the last few years which organizations will roll out the most like progressive bereavement leaves and why. And it was really in the wake of Sheryl Sandberg losing her husband that Facebook, now Meta, dropped like the most progressive, incredible, considerate bereavement plan. But it required like the big boss COO to lose her husband to be like, oh, actually, this is totally is ineffective and doesn't work. So it's interesting to think about like where is an organization's bias based on the people who are making decisions around whether grief is something that is worth looking at and tending to and coming up with your own strategy and approach to. And not all organizations can afford like the Cadillac of bereavement care that something like an organization like a Facebook can offer. And yet there's a lot to learn about what might happen if your organization became conscious of its relationship to grief and the small changes it might make to support employees.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. So one of the things that resonated there was like, it's not just like, let's not overthink and overcomplicate the solution. If the intent is right around the action, if there's mistakes made, then it's okay that mistakes are made as long as the intent is good. Right?
I think so. And that, yeah, I think that was the first point. And then the second point is like, second most important thing being recognizing where there are unconscious bias within a leadership team such that they might not yet have prioritized something like grief care or grief literacy in the workplace, and what would it take to make that conscious.
Yeah. You had mentioned in the beginning and also in your book that Renegade is someone who deserts the status quo. I have two questions around that. One, can you share a bit of history around grief in the Western culture? And then secondly, how does the Eastern culture deal with grief, and how is it different? Because that we may be able to learn from that on both sides.
Yeah. So I named the book Renegade Grief because I kept hearing stories of people who were like, listen, I didn't have all that much support when I was going through a loss experience. And in fact, the culture that I lived in made me think that I should kind of like be, quote, back to normal after the first year. So I had to be a little bit of a rebel, a little bit of an outlaw, like deviate from the cultural norm to find the community that I needed and the care practices that I longed for to tend to my grief. And I love what I love about the title, not to like, pat my own book on its back, but I feel like for too long, grief has been treated with this kind of like cozy pity. It's sort of this, often, you look at the landscape of many grief book covers and it's all sort of pastel watercolors and nature images. And I love both of those things. And yet I think that we've had this kind of cultural association with grief as this kind of like pitiful experience that people go through. The reality that I've experienced in being in relationship with grievers is that it's epic. It tests us. It is in many ways a transformative portal through which people come to real acknowledgement of like what matters most to them, who matters most to them, how do they want to spend their precious time on earth. So it felt important for me to kind of give the book that torque of conversation around actually tending to your grief is a radical act in a culture that would have you forget it. And I think, there's a couple big milestones that psychological history people look at over the 20th century. One that I often talk about is Freud, not to throw him under the bus, but he wrote this treatise called Mourning and Melancholia that came out in the early 20th century. And in it, he was basically like, the right thing to do when someone dies is to get over it, to break bonds, was the language that emerged from that. Despite the fact that humans have been in relationship to ancestors and grieving collectively for as long as we have human history recorded. And I think what was going on there was we were entering this era of human history where there was death and destruction and this sort of world war scale. And we were trying to figure out how to cope with losses and sort of these like in these massive ways that humans hadn't experienced yet. Anyway, so Freud releases this manifesto, and it kind of becomes psychological best practice for the remainder of the 20th century, that the thing to do is break bonds, don't talk about it, don't talk about them, move forward, get over it. And what's wild is that Freud's daughter died a few years after that paper came out, and it was his favorite daughter, which I think is so funny. He always refers to her as his favorite daughter. I was like, okay,
to be honest,
we weren't supposed to say that, but he died of the Spanish flu, which is like the biggest pandemic that the world knew before COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote in a letter to a friend that was basically like, he didn't say, oh crap, but he was like, wow, I miss her. And I don't actually think this grief is ever going to go away. Like, it's a part of me in the same way that loving her is a part of me. And the irony of it is that the paper he'd written years before had already set in motion this like psychological best practice, and then was realizing as a griever himself, like, oh, maybe there's a different way. And in the course of the 20th century later on, there was plenty of other research that refuted it, and continuing bonds is now the best practice, and titrating between tending to our grief and not tending to our grief is a healthy thing to do in what's called the dual process model. But I look at some of the patterns in my own family, for example, and I've heard stories of people from recounting their family patterns. Mm-hmm. The breaking bonds model is like still in our cultural muscle memory. Yeah. And I am excited for the next generation that comes in to figure out how do we knead that out of the muscle memory such that we can return to a time where it's okay to honor the dead, where it's okay to show emotion, whether we're keening or other kind of ancestral practices around grief, so that we don't let it get stuck. And I think like the Eastern Western paradigm, I always struggle with, like, it feels like an oversimplification in many ways, but you know, there's so many other examples of cultures outside of America where there is still collective grief practices in motion on the regular. And a lot of what ended up in the book is kind of zooming out from our status quo to look at what other places' status quos have been or are currently, just to expand our frame of reference of what's possible, so that we can expand our own frame of reference of what's possible in our lives and how we tend to our grief.
Yeah. I also think, like, if you're trying to break the bond, you're basically trying to say that the person didn't exist, right?
And like the person that you were with them didn't exist. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of this denial, to your point earlier, and this sort of disassociation from a whole important part of our own lives.
Yeah. And people who probably defined us as well, right? How often do you grieve now?
You know, it's interesting. It's been 15 years since my dad died, and I still, I would not say I am acutely grieving in the sense of like the somatic reaction to grief, which is brain fog, and you know, it's all the different kinds of ways that grief impacts our body and our brain. Shout out Mary Frances O'Connor, who's an incredible researcher has written 2 books on that. But it comes up in subtle ways. You know, my dad was Jose Fernandez III, and my brother is Jose Fernandez IV, and my brother just had a son, Jose Fernandez V, and we just recently baptized him and celebrated his arrival on planet Earth. And I've come to accept the fact that, like, in that, you know, in the luncheon that we had afterwards, like, I certainly, of course, missed my dad. Of course, I wish that he had been able to be there to see his namesake enter the family, and to be there for my brother, who was a new parent. And, you know, I could make a list of all of the things that I was grieving in that moment. Mm-hmm. And also, like, I love my nephew and I'm his godmother, and like we'll be there for him for as long as I get to be on the planet Earth. And so, I've learned to kind of hold what a teacher that I've studied with named Martine Prechtel says, that grief and praise are asleep in the same bed, or two sides of the same coin. And that oftentimes in my life, when I feel like I am grieving my father, I am also praising like the person that he was and the impact that he had and the legacy that he left.
Yeah. Wow. Well, this is amazing. If we want to get a copy of your book, how do we get it? Is it on Amazon?
It's available wherever books are sold. Amazon, your local indie can order it if they don't already have one in stock. I have a website, carlafernandez.co, and there's like a link to a bunch of retailers there. Okay. And I also released a companion guide that's available for free on my website. So after you read a chapter of the book, if you're looking for reflection questions and additional reading and ritual ideas, kind of prompts to lead into your own care practices, I was like, let me not write one book, but two. And the book number 2 is available for free on my website for folks that are interested. I just ask that you drop me your email. And and if you are in this 21 to 45 age range, and you, Ashish, but also people who are listening and are looking for community and connection around grief, come to the dinnerparty.org. You can find out there how to start your very own table, whether it's in a specific place where you live, to gather in person, whether it's virtual. We have more and more tables that are gathering specific to affinities, so specific loss types, specific identity types, and more folks are coming together being like, I don't just want to meet for dinner, but I also want to go hiking with this group and expand beyond the table. So lots of resources and tools available for people who are looking for this peer support in times of grief. And you can also check out our workplace resilience subpage on our website, which is the kind of the title for the workplace trainings that we offer. So it's all there, and there's lots. I know it's a tricky topic to approach, but I feel like our organization is doing an incredible job of being like the warm hug that people need to actually sit down and think about their grief readiness.
Yes, definitely. Well, thank you so much. This is very enlightening. I really enjoyed the discussion.
Of course. Right back at you. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely.